The lake house had always been my sanctuary. 40 years of summers, holidays, and quiet weekends. When I pulled into the gravel driveway that Thursday afternoon, I noticed the silver BMW parked near the side entrance. I didn't recognize it. My wife Helen had passed 3 years ago, and I kept track of every visitor to this property. I knew every neighbor's vehicle within a 10-mile radius. I had driven up from Cincinnati to meet with a contractor about replacing the dock. The old wooden planks were rotting, and I wanted to get the work done before spring. Tom Mitchell, the contractor, was supposed to meet me at 2 o'clock. It was 1:45. I was early. I parked my truck behind the BMW and stepped out. The April air was crisp, carrying the smell of pine and thawing earth. Birds were singing somewhere in the trees. Everything seemed peaceful, normal. I had no idea my life was about to change completely. As I walked toward the front door, I heard something. At my house. I stopped walking. My hand was already reaching for my phone when I recognized the woman's laugh. It was a laugh I had heard hundreds of times over the past 8 years. At family dinners, at Christmas gatherings, at my grandson's birthday parties. It was my daughter-in-law, Victoria. My son, David, and Victoria had been married for 8 years. They had 2 children together, my grandchildren, Emma, who was 6, and little Michael, who was 4. David worked as a software engineer at a company in Columbus. He traveled frequently for work. In fact, I knew he was in Seattle this week for a conference. He had called me just 2 days ago to tell me about it. So what was Victoria doing at my lake house? With a man? I stood frozen on the walkway, trying to process what I was hearing. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was the television. Maybe she had brought the kids up here for some reason. Though I couldn't imagine why she would do that without telling me. This was still my property after all. I walked quietly to the side window and looked inside. What I saw made my heart drop into my stomach. Victoria was sitting on my couch. My wife's couch, where Helen used to read her mystery novels on summer evenings. And she was not alone. A man I had never seen before was sitting next to her. Too close. His arm was around her shoulders. As I watched, he leaned in and kissed her neck. She tilted her head back and laughed again, that same laugh I'd heard from outside. I felt sick, physically sick. This was the woman my son loved, the mother of my grandchildren, and she was here, in my house, with another man. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I just stood there, watching through the window like some kind of voyeur in my own life. The man said something I couldn't hear, and Victoria laughed again. She reached up and touched his face. It was an intimate gesture. Familiar. This was clearly not their first time together. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Tom Mitchell, the contractor, letting me know he was running about 15 minutes late. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I had a choice to make. I could confront them right now. I could burst through that door and demand an explanation. I could scream, yell, throw the man out of my house. That's what my instincts were telling me to do. That's what any father would want to do. But I was 63 years old. I had spent 40 years as a corporate attorney before retiring. I had seen enough situations in my career to know that acting on emotion rarely leads to good outcomes. Evidence matters. Documentation matters. Timing matters. I stepped back from the window. I walked quietly back to my truck. And I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I was going to handle this the right way. I drove back down the road about a quarter mile and parked in a small turnout that was hidden from the lake house by trees. I sat there for about 10 minutes, thinking, planning. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. First, I needed evidence. Real evidence that would hold up. Photographs, timestamps, anything that could prove what I had seen. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out the small digital camera I kept there for photographing property damage for insurance purposes. Old habits from my legal career. Always document everything. I got out of the truck and walked back toward the lake house through the woods. There was an old path that Helen and I used to take for morning walks. It came out near the back of the property, behind the storage shed. From there, I could see the back deck and the large windows that faced the lake. I moved slowly, carefully. I didn't want to make any noise. I didn't want to alert them to my presence. Part of me felt ridiculous, creeping through the woods like some kind of spy. But the larger part of me knew this was necessary. When I reached the storage shed, I had a clear view of the back of the house. The curtains were open. Through the large windows, I could see into the living room. Victoria and the man had moved from the couch. They were standing now, near the kitchen island. He was pouring wine into 2 glasses. My wine, I realized. Wine I had bought last fall and left in the rack above the refrigerator. I raised the camera and started taking photographs. Click. Victoria accepting a glass of wine. Click. The man touching her waist. Click. Victoria leaning into him. Click. A kiss. A long one. I took maybe 20 photographs over the next 10 minutes. Each one felt like a knife in my chest. This was my son's wife, the woman who had promised to love and honor him. The mother of my grandchildren. I thought about David, about how hard he worked, about how much he loved Victoria and the kids, about how he always talked about building their future together. Every extra hour he spent at work, every business trip he took, was supposedly for his family, for her. And this is what she was doing while he was away. My phone buzzed again. Tom Mitchell. He was at the lake house and wondering where I was. I quickly texted back that I had been delayed and asked if he could come back in an hour. He agreed. Good. That gave me time. I continued watching. The man and Victoria moved toward the back door. For a moment, I thought they were going to come outside, and I pressed myself against the wall of the shed. But they stopped at the door and just stood there, looking out at the lake. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. She leaned back against him. They looked comfortable, natural, like a real couple. This wasn't some impulsive fling. This was a relationship, an ongoing affair. After a few more minutes, they moved away from the door and disappeared from my view. I waited. About 15 minutes later, I heard the front door open and close. I crept around the side of the shed until I could see the driveway. The man was walking toward the silver BMW. He was maybe 40 years old, tall, dark hair, wearing expensive-looking clothes, a sport coat and designer jeans. He looked successful, confident. He got into the BMW and started the engine. I raised my camera one more time and photographed the license plate. After he drove away, I stayed hidden for another 10 minutes. I wanted to see what Victoria would do. Eventually, she came out the front door carrying her purse. She locked the house with a key to my house. I had given David a spare key years ago, and apparently he had given it to her. She got into her car, a white Lexus SUV, and drove away in the opposite direction from the BMW. Smart. They weren't leaving together. They weren't taking any chances. I waited until both cars had been gone for at least 15 minutes before I walked back to the lake house. I let myself in with my own key and looked around. The wine glasses were washed and put away. The couch cushions were straightened. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I never would have known anyone had been here. She was careful, meticulous. How long had this been going on? I walked through the house, looking for any other signs. In the master bedroom, the bed was made, but not quite the way I remembered leaving it. The pillows were in different positions. There was a slight indentation in the comforter. I stood in the doorway of that bedroom, the bedroom where Helen and I had slept for 40 years, and I felt a rage building inside me that I had never experienced before. Not just for the betrayal of my son, but for the violation of my home. My memories, my wife's memory. Victoria had brought her lover here, to this sacred place, and she had used it like some cheap motel. I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. Rage wouldn't help David. Only evidence would. Only a plan. I called Tom Mitchell and asked him to come back. I met with him about the dock, discussed materials and timelines and costs. The whole time, my mind was somewhere else, but I needed to maintain appearances. I needed everything to seem normal. After Tom left, I sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started making notes. This was what I did best: building a case, analyzing the facts, planning a strategy. First question: who was the man? I had his license plate number. I still had contacts from my legal career who could help me with that. A friend who ran a private investigation firm. We had worked together on dozens of cases over the years. I picked up my phone and called Frank Peterson. Frank and I went way back. He had helped me with corporate investigations, asset searches, background checks. He was discreet, professional, and thorough. Exactly what I needed. I told him I needed information on a license plate. I gave him the number. I asked him to find out everything he could about the owner. He didn't ask why. That's what I always appreciated about Frank. He understood that some things needed to be handled quietly. He called me back 2 hours later. The BMW was registered to a man named Bradley Thornton. Age 42. Home address in Upper Arlington, one of the wealthiest suburbs of Columbus. Married with 2 children, he worked as a financial advisor at a prestigious firm downtown. Married. He was married to. The betrayal had layers. Frank continued with his report. Bradley Thornton had been with his firm for 15 years. He managed portfolios for high-net-worth clients. His wife's name was Jennifer. They had been married for 14 years. I asked Frank how long he thought this affair might have been going on. He said he would need to do more digging to find out. Phone records, credit card statements, things like that. It would take time and resources. I told him to do whatever was necessary. Money was not an issue. My son's future was at stake. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank compiled a comprehensive file on Bradley Thornton and his relationship with my daughter-in-law. What he found was worse than I had imagined. The affair had been going on for at least 18 months. Frank found hotel receipts, restaurant charges, even a weekend trip to Chicago that Victoria had told David was a girl's getaway with her college friends. She had been with Bradley Thornton the entire time. But that wasn't the worst part. Frank discovered something else during his investigation. Something that made my blood run cold. Victoria had been making withdrawals from the joint checking account she shared with David. Small amounts at first. A few $100s here and there. But over the past year, the amounts had increased. $2,000, $3,000, $5,000. Always in cash. Always when David was traveling for work. The total was over $40,000. Frank couldn't prove where the money was going, but he had a theory. Bradley Thornton had recently taken out a second mortgage on his house. His firm was under investigation for some questionable investment practices. He was in financial trouble. Victoria wasn't just cheating on my son. She was stealing from him to support her lover. I sat with this information for 3 days. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Victoria's face. That innocent smile she always gave David, the way she called him honey and told him she loved him. All of it was lies. Every single word. I wanted to tell David immediately. I wanted to drive to his house and show him everything. But I knew that would be a mistake. David loved Victoria. He would want to believe there was some explanation. He might even be angry at me for investigating his wife. No. I needed to be strategic about this. I needed professional advice. I called my old colleague, Patricia Mendez. She was one of the best family law attorneys in Ohio. We had worked on the opposite sides of many corporate cases over the years, and I respected her judgment completely. I drove to Columbus and met with her in her office. I laid out everything. The photographs from the lake house, the license plate, Frank's investigation, the bank records, all of it. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke. "This is bad," she said. "But it's also an opportunity. If your son wants to divorce her, he has grounds for fault. More importantly, the financial fraud gives him leverage for the custody and property settlement." She explained the legal strategy. In Ohio, adultery itself doesn't affect divorce proceedings much anymore. But the financial misconduct was different. If Victoria had been systematically stealing from the marital assets to give to her lover, that was dissipation of marital funds. It could significantly impact how property was divided, and the custody situation was even more important. Victoria had been lying to David for at least 18 months. She had been stealing money. She had been making decisions that put her affair above her children's welfare. All of this could be used to argue that David should have primary custody of Emma and Michael. But Patricia warned me, Timing was critical. We needed to make sure David was prepared. We needed to have all the documentation in order. And we needed to act before Victoria had any chance to hide assets or destroy evidence. I asked Patricia what the first step should be. She said I needed to talk to David. That was the hardest conversation of my life. I called David and asked him to come to my house in Cincinnati. I told him it was important and that I needed to discuss something with him in person. He sounded concerned but agreed to drive down that Saturday. When he arrived, I sat him down in my study, the room where I'd spent countless hours working on cases over the years. The room where I'd always felt most in control. I didn't know how to begin. How do you tell your son that his wife has been betraying him? That the woman he loves, the mother of his children, has been lying to him every single day? I started with the lake house. I told him about driving up there to meet the contractor, about hearing the laughter, about seeing Victoria through the window. David's face went pale. He started shaking his head before I even finished. "No," he said, "that's not possible. Victoria would never do that." I showed him the photographs. He stared at them for a long time. His hands were trembling. I watched my son's heart break in real time, and it nearly destroyed me. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "How long?" he asked. I told him everything Frank had discovered. The 18 months, the hotels, the trip to Chicago, Bradley Thornton and his wife, and his financial troubles. And then I told him about the money. David looked at me like I had stabbed him. $40,000. He kept repeating it. $40,000. I showed him the bank records, the withdrawal patterns, the way Victoria had timed everything to coincide with his business trips. David stood up and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the backyard where he had played as a child, where he had learned to throw a baseball, where he had brought Victoria to meet his mother for the first time. Finally, he turned around. "What do I do, Dad?" I told him about Patricia Mendez, about the legal strategy, about how we could protect him and the children. David nodded slowly. He looked older somehow, like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. "I want to talk to her first," he said. "I need to hear it from her." I understood, but I asked him to wait just a few more days. We needed to make sure everything was in place. We needed to secure the remaining finances. We needed to document the current state of all the accounts before Victoria had any chance to move things around. David agreed. He trusted me. He had always trusted me. Over the next week, Patricia and I worked quickly. We subpoenaed bank records, we documented the joint accounts, and David's separate retirement funds. We gathered every piece of evidence into a comprehensive file. Patricia also discovered something else. Bradley Thornton's firm was not just under investigation. They were facing a federal inquiry for mishandling client funds. Bradley was potentially looking at criminal charges. His affair with Victoria was the least of his problems. I decided to make one more phone call. Not to Victoria, not to David, but to someone else entirely. I called Jennifer Thornton, Bradley's wife. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was pleasant, unsuspecting. She probably thought I was trying to sell her something. I introduced myself. I told her I was sorry to bother her, but I had information about her husband that I thought she should know. I told her I had evidence of an ongoing affair between Bradley and a woman named Victoria. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Jennifer finally spoke, her voice was ice cold. She asked me to send her the evidence. She gave me an email address. I sent her a selection of the photographs, the hotel receipts, the trip to Chicago. Jennifer called me back 2 hours later. She thanked me. Her voice was shaking, but she thanked me. She said she had suspected something for months but couldn't prove it. She said this explained so many things. The late nights, the business trips, the second mortgage she had questioned. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her my son was going to confront his wife. I told her about the money Victoria had been stealing. Jennifer laughed bitterly. "Of course," she said. "Of course Victoria was giving him money." Bradley had been bleeding them dry for months. He had even taken money from their children's college funds. We talked for almost an hour. Two parents, united by betrayal, trying to figure out how to protect our children and grandchildren from the fallout. By the end of the call, We had agreed on something. We would coordinate. We would confront our spouses at the same time. That way, neither Victoria nor Bradley would have a chance to warn the other. They would both be blindsided, just like we had been. We set a date. Sunday evening. 1 week away. The longest week of my life. David came to my house on Saturday night. He was staying with me so Victoria wouldn't suspect anything. He had told her he was visiting an old college friend who was in town. We sat up late that night, talking. David told me about his marriage, about how things had seemed fine on the surface, about how Victoria had always been a good mother, a good wife, or so he thought. He asked me if I thought she had ever loved him. I didn't know how to answer that. I told him that people are complicated, that love and betrayal can exist in the same heart, that what mattered now was not the past, but the future. His future, the children's future. David nodded. He seemed calmer than I expected, more resigned. Maybe the shock had worn off and left only determination in its place. Sunday morning, we drove to Columbus together. Patricia met us at David's house at 4 o'clock. We went over the plan one more time. David would confront Victoria alone. Patricia and I would wait in the study, ready to step in if needed. I had already texted Jennifer Thornton. She was going to confront Bradley at the same time, at their home across town. Victoria arrived home at 5:30. She had been at her mother's house with the kids. Emma and Michael ran inside first, excited to see their father. David hugged them tightly, longer than usual. I watched from the hallway, and I saw tears in his eyes that he quickly blinked away. Victoria came in a few minutes later, carrying grocery bags. She smiled when she saw David. "You're home early," she said. "I thought you were staying at your dad's another night." David said the kids needed to go to the playroom. Victoria looked confused but agreed. Once Emma and Michael were safely upstairs, David turned to face his wife. "We need to talk," he said. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "About what?" David didn't answer. He just walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. Victoria followed, still looking confused. She sat across from him in the armchair. I watched from the doorway of the study. Patricia was beside me, ready. David started talking. He told Victoria about the lake house, about me seeing her there with another man, about the photographs. Victoria's face went white. She started to speak, but David held up his hand. He told her about the investigation, about Bradley Thornton, about the 18 months, about Chicago. Victoria was crying now. She kept saying no, over and over. She kept saying it wasn't what he thought. David told her about the money. That's when Victoria stopped crying. Her face changed. The tears dried up. Something harder appeared in her eyes. "Who told you all this?" she demanded. "Your father?" David didn't answer. Victoria stood up. She was angry now. She accused me of spying on her, of violating her privacy, of turning her husband against her. I stepped into the room. Victoria saw me and froze. For a moment, we just looked at each other. I thought about all the family dinners, all the holidays, all the times she had hugged me and called me dad and told me how much she appreciated having me as a father-in-law. All lies. I spoke calmly. I told her that I had seen what I saw. I told her that the evidence was irrefutable. I told her that her affair with Bradley Thornton was over, one way or another. I also told her that Jennifer Thornton knew everything. That right now, at this very moment, Jennifer was confronting Bradley with the same evidence. Victoria's face crumbled. She actually staggered backward, like I had physically pushed her. She looked at David. She started begging, pleading. She said it was a mistake. She said it didn't mean anything. She said she loved him and the children, and she would do anything to make it right. David listened. He let her talk, and when she was finished, he spoke. He said 2 words: "I want a divorce." The next few months were difficult. There were lawyers and negotiations and custody hearings. Victoria fought hard at first, but the evidence was overwhelming. The photographs, the bank records, the testimony of Jennifer Thornton, who had filed for divorce from Bradley on the same day. Patricia Mendez was brilliant. She used the financial fraud to argue that Victoria could not be trusted with the children's welfare. She presented evidence of Victoria's deception, her poor judgment. her willingness to put her affair above her family. In the end, David was awarded primary custody of Emma and Michael. Victoria got supervised visitation every other weekend. The property settlement was heavily in David's favor, accounting for the $40,000 she had stolen. Bradley Thornton did not fare well either. His firm collapsed under the federal investigation. He lost his license. Jennifer divorced him and took everything. Last I heard, he was working as a car salesman in Dayton. Victoria moved back in with her parents. She tried to contact David several times in the following months, asking for another chance. He never responded. As for me, I still have the lake house. I went back there last month. For the first time since that Thursday afternoon, I walked through the rooms and remembered Helen. I sat on the dock and watched the sun set over the water. David brought the kids up for a visit the next day. Emma and Michael ran around the yard, playing tag, their laughter echoing off the trees. David sat beside me on the dock, 2 fishing poles in the water. "Thanks, Dad," he said. I asked him what for. "For everything," he said. "For handling it the right way. For not just storming in there that day at the lake house. For building the case instead of just reacting." I told him that's what fathers do. We protect our children, no matter how old they get. David nodded. He looked tired, but there was something else in his eyes. Peace, maybe. Or the beginning of it. The fish weren't biting that day. We didn't catch anything. But it didn't matter. We sat there together, father and son, watching our lines drift in the water. Behind us, Emma and Michael were laughing. That was enough. My phone buzzed later that evening. A text from Jennifer Thornton. She had met someone new, a decent man, she said, someone who treated her well. She wanted to thank me again for the phone call that had changed her life. I texted back that I was happy for her, that she deserved good things. I thought about that phone call a lot in the months that followed. One call, that's all it took. Not to my son, but to the woman who had as much right to know the truth as he did. Sometimes justice isn't about anger or revenge. Sometimes it's just about giving people the information they need to make their own choices. The truth, delivered at the right time, in the right way, can be more powerful than any confrontation. Victoria made her choices. Bradley made his. They both have to live with the consequences. And David is rebuilding. He started dating again recently, a woman he met through work. She seems kind, genuine, nothing like Victoria. I met her last week when David brought her to dinner. She shook my hand and looked me in the eye and said she had heard a lot about me. "All good things, I hope," I said. She smiled. "The best," she said. I watched David watching her. I saw something in his face that I hadn't seen in years. Hope. That night, after they left, I sat in my study with a glass of bourbon and thought about everything that had happened. The lake house, the photographs, the phone calls, the lawyers, the hearings. It had been a long road, painful, necessary. But looking at my son now, seeing him start to heal, watching my grandchildren laugh and play without knowing how close they came to a very different kind of life, I knew I had made the right choice. I had made the call, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of love. That's what fathers do. To hear the next story, click on the video on your screen. If you want to support the channel, like and subscribe. And if you have your own story of betrayal and justice, leave a comment below. I read every single one. Until next time.